So good evening, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to our webinar with one of my heroes. I've had the privilege of knowing Vinod Rai now for the best part of, I think, 15 years. And I think in those 15 years, I can safely say he's been one of the people who's changed India in many different ways. We hope to discuss some of that this evening. So just before we begin, I'll quickly lay out the format. Those of you who attended Marcellus webinars before would be familiar with the format. I'll do a Q&A with Vinod for the first 30 minutes or so. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. From the 30-minute mark onwards, from the half an hour mark onwards, my colleague Salil Desai will take questions and take your questions and put them to Vinod. So with that said, let me get on with it. Some of you might not have met Vinod or heard about him. So for those, especially those outside India who are unfamiliar with Vinod Rai, he is famously a former officer of the IAS, but calling him a former officer of the IAS is saying Diego Maradona is a footballer. He's much more than just a normal officer. He was the 11th Comptroller and Auditor General of India from 2008 to 13. He transformed the office of the CAG in my view. As many of you remember, 2010 was the year when the CAG tabled a report saying that the 2G spectrum allocation by the government had caused a presumptive loss equal to $21 billion. And that in turn catalyzed a set of events which I think have been transformational. In 2015, Vinod was made the chairman of the bank's board bureau. I think, if my memory serves me right, he was the first chairman of the bank's board bureau. And then memorably in January 2017, the Supreme Court appointed Vinod Rai as the chairman of the Board of Cricket Control for India. I think he served in that position for the best part of 2 years. Again, transformative impact. Hopefully we'll get a chance to discuss some of that as well. Today, post his retirement from public service, Vinod does several interesting things, including he's a distinguished visiting research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. That's the structure I think you can see there behind Vinod. That's the NUS structure, the National University of Singapore structure that you see behind Vinod. He's also a trustee on the global board of IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards people. INDAS in India is a derivative of IFRS. Vinod is on the global board of trustees for that. He's also a chair of the fund for the Advisory Commission of Kerala Infrastructure and Investment Board. I suppose the reason for Vinod being the chair on an infrastructure board in Kerala is he was a government of Kerala IAS officer. He served a big part of his IAS career in Kerala. In 2016, Vinod Rai was conferred the Padma Bhushan by the government of India, and in 2011 he figured as one of the persons of the year in the Forbes magazine. I think, Vinod, in addition, you're on the United Nations' external audit panel. Is that correct?
No more.
They used to be there.
Yeah, I ceased to be there.
Okay. And I'll stop there. I could go on for another 10 minutes. It won't stop, but I think you get the point. We're talking to an individual who's had a transformative impact. So Vinod, thank you very much for joining us this evening. We're here to discuss your writings and what the messages in those writings and what your writing, what your work implies for India. So let me kick off by asking you sort of a question you might have been asked before. You write books, you write very powerful books, right? I remember reading Not Just an Accountant when you published it in 2014. It's hard-hitting stuff, right? Even today I read it 10 years after you published it. It's intensely hard-hitting. I read your book. I read your more recent book, Transforming the Steel Frame. That makes powerful recommendations on how the country needs to change. I read Rethinking Good Governance a couple of years ago. What is it in you that leads you to write these hard-hitting books? Most people in India retire, they buy a house in the hills and then they play plenty of golf. Why do something different, Vinod?
Saurabh, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to be amongst your distinguished panelists and distinguished listeners to this webinar. It's a delight to be, and I think all the people participating today wouldn't know that I got to know Saurabh after I retired. And Saurabh was a teacher for me in a large number of things such as private equity and investment and things, which I still don't understand, but he did undertake an attempt at primary education as far as I'm concerned on those things. And I've continued that association with Saurabh and enjoyed it too. And Saurabh and his team, wherever he has worked. Now, Saurabh, when you retire, when you're unemployed, and you become a benign private citizen, and you also kind of go into the hills and start saying there, what else do you do? And as far as I'm concerned, I always felt that there was a lot I could do by associating myself with the university and things like that. There's still a desire to do research and do a PhD. I don't know whether I'll be ever be able to do it. But then I thought, experience, my views, the issues that I have dealt with, it's better that I chronicle them, put them into words, and share my thoughts with thinking kind of people like all of you that are listening to me today. And that's how I started writing things, right? And believe me, I didn't know how to type. I had to settle down and start myself, teach myself how to type on a desktop. And that's what I've been doing. And these are the books that I have produced along with my association in the university, National University of Singapore.
So let's start with your first book, sir. Let's start with Not Just an Accountant, right? The book starts with your early days as a civil servant in Kerala, but then obviously as the book's sort of climactic chapter is the 2G spectrum allocation matter, which took place, I think, 2008, 9, 10. Now, we all know the sort of the highlights, the key highlight being the CAG's assertion that the presumptive loss to the government of India was $21 billion. What will be great is if you just talk us through the kind of the stresses and strains of doing something which was so game-changing. Until that juncture, until you came live on TV, I still remember November 2010, you came live on daytime TV. And until that moment, very few people in India had appreciated the power of the Comptroller and Auditor General of India. What did it feel like to live through that experience of changing an institution?
Sort of actually, it's not really changing an institution, because this institution, through the period of time, right from the days of the Kargil War, or even before that, when there were things being talked about, the Bofors, etc. These were issues which had been brought out by the Comptroller and Auditor General itself. But I think what happened during my tenure in the institution was that a few events kind of came together collectively. And the first one was the spectrum issue, then the Commonwealth Games, then the coal issue. These kind of came together. So I think the public, the parliament, and the administration, the executive, that's the government, got a rather heavy dose of reports of the CAG. Now, living through the entire experience, it's very surprising that the kind of appetite that we citizens at that point of time had developed towards malfeasance. When you hear that imports of lentils, 16,000 crores have been lost, nobody really bothers about it. It comes into media domain for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, and it's forgotten. Makes 1 day of discussion in the parliament, it's all over. When you hear that 31,000 crores have been lost in ultra mega power projects or something like that, yet, the citizenry accepts it and says, okay, it's been lost, discusses it for about a week, and then forgets all about it. It's only when a large figure turns up before you that people sit up and take notice. Now, we did debate a lot about this issue of presumptive loss. It's not that we cooked up this, terminology of presumptive loss. Presumptive loss is a definition given in World Bank and IMF documents. We have been using it in the past, but in our reports which deal with taxation and revenue matters, where you say the presumptive loss of not assessing income tax properly or GST properly or value-added tax properly is maybe 70 crores or 90 crores or things like that. So it has been there in public domain, in parliament notices, and in audit reports of the CAG. But it's when this figure comes out and you discuss the figures and then say, okay, how is it going to be? Now, I think the reaction of the public, the reaction of the people was along what I would say predictable lines. As far as we were concerned, before we put out the report, we had 2 rounds of discussions with the government. We shared our draft report with the government. We took all that they had to provide us in terms of their answers to whatever issues that we were raising. It's only when we found that they were not able to put in any newer elements that we decided to put it out. Now, in the press conference, surprisingly, it was not me who held the press conference. The press conference was held by the Deputy CAG, who does the study. Deputy CAG was in charge of this study. And this is, again, not a practice that was started by us. It was a practice we started in 1988, post the Bofors kind of issue, when all kinds of misleading information coming out of the CAG's office was floating around in public domain. It was then that between the government, the PAC, and the CAG, it was decided that the day the report is put into Parliament, which means it is a public document, the CAG's office will hold a press conference to objectively explain the contents of that report. So there is no scope for any misleading information to be. And that's what we followed. Now, this practice was questioned by the Jayalalitha government in Tamil Nadu at some point of time in 2004, if I remember correctly. And that was the time when the High Court of Tamil Nadu took the stand that the CAG's practice is a perfectly correct, appropriate practice, and it should be continued. But that was a decision of 2004. So, we had anticipated that there would be certain reactions. There will be certain brickbats to face. It all happened like that. And, the rest, of course, it went into Parliament, and you all know what happened after that.
So, Vinod, let's come to the current day. This morning's Business Standard, I read an interview with A.M. Naik, the L&T chairman, where Mr. Naik said that the system for road tendering, he contends, he says, is broken. And his point of view is that what's happening is the government is giving the road tenders to whichever contractor lowballs the bid, right, on a L1 basis. Whoever lowballs the bid is getting the road contract. And Mr. Naik is contending that, say, large contractors like L&T, they build their part of the road or they build their part of the Mumbai Metro. But the smaller contractor who's lowballed the bid is not able to pull through. And as a result, the project flounders, right? And as you'd imagine, right, road contracts, metro contracts are bound to have public money involved. So as soon as I read that, I was thinking that, it's been a decade since you demitted the CAG's office. It's been a decade since Vinod Rai stepped down as CAG. Do you think the CAG today is a stronger, fitter, better institution than it was 10 years ago, or has it regressed?
No, see, if you look at the professional content of the CAG's office, it's absolutely par excellence. They are very good. And the good thing about it is that they keep upgrading their auditing or accounting knowledge at every stage of their careers. So whether it's training them within the country, training them outside the country, they are just about the best. And why I say that is not because I have worked with them, but because, and I'll give you only 2 examples. I mean, the CAG audited the United Nations, audited the World Food Program, etc., etc. But 2 agencies, the International Atomic Energy Agency and the World Intellectual Property Organization, the IAEA is in Vienna, based in Vienna. WIPO is based in Geneva. You all know that these two agencies had never been audited before by any other Auditor General other than the European Auditor General or the US Auditor General. But it was during somewhere around 2010 or 2011 that the Indian CAG was selected to audit both these agencies. And these are very specialized agencies requiring very specialized professional audit. So to that extent, even now, some of the agencies in the European continent, which are international agencies, are being audited by the CAG. So I don't think that in any way the professional content, the objectivity, and the related accountability of that institution in any way has regressed.
Fantastic. I'm delighted to hear that, and it's reassuring to hear that, because a lot hinges on the CAG holding the government accountable. Let's move to the broader civil service, right? I think the British called the civil service the steel frame that holds India together. And in your books, there's plenty of discussion on what the Indians now, the government of India calls it the ails, the Indian Administrative Service. Right. So one of the things I learned from Rethinking Good Governance, and I was stunned to read this. In Rethinking Good Governance, you say that a typical IAS officer's posting lasts only 18 months. Right? A typical IAS officer's posting lasts only 18 months. And then in that book, you explain that harassing honest officers or harassing good officers through frequent transfers is a well-known tactic used by the powers that be. In the decade since you left the IAS, have things improved, Vinod, or are we sort of regressing again on this front in how we treat good IAS officers?
I must say that the content of IAS officers today has been substantially good, very good. Okay. Yes, there have been instances of officers being shunted around if people find that they are not convenient to their maybe political or whatever requirements. But then I wouldn't say it's a norm. The kind of sample that I took at that point of time, it was 18 months, but then there are two extremes. Now, we must understand that IAS officers in the first 15 years of their tenure work largely in states only. IAS officers are born on the strength of the state government. Like I'm a Kerala cadre officer, one could be a UP officer, a Haryana officer, wherever it is. But at any point of time, 1/3 of the strength of IAS officers are supposed to be on deputation to the central government. So central government does not have IAS officers on its own roll. It takes on deputations. Yeah. And if you come on deputation to the government of India, you have a 5-year tenure. You then are expected to go back. So those 5 years normally are in a same post, same ministry, same department. So to that extent, you are gaining a certain amount of expertise. Yes, there have been a large number of instances where to harass officers, you see, you are a permanent civil servant, maybe a politician may find you inconvenient. He cannot dismiss you. The only thing that he can do is inconvenience you by transferring you frequently. I mean, inconvenience in the sense that you have a family, you have children, who are being educated in various places, and frequent transfers does create a certain amount of upheaval in your personal life. Now, that is a kind of a weapon which is used against IAS officers, but I would not generalize that. Right. To the extent that one is aware, people, what should I say, well-performing officers, of course, you have to do a certain amount of balancing, fine-tuning in handling a politician, handling the bureaucracy with you. But a well-performing officer does succeed in staying on in whatever job that he is posted to.
That's an interesting point that you make, that once an officer goes from the state to the center on deputation, that 5-year term is more or less assured. And in that regard, we the citizenry are we the citizenry are shielded from the worst excesses that politicians might exert. I hadn't thought of that. Folks, there is plenty in Vinod's book. I'll bring the book up on the screen. If you guys want to read about what he's written, this book is called Rethinking Good Governance. There's an entire chapter. This chapter, Civil Services has the Steel Frames Act, on where Vinod explains the challenges that IS officers have to deal with and how he thinks they can be dealt with. My favorite chapter of this book, right, of Rethinking Good Governance, was the RBI chapter, the Reserve Bank of India. And in a way, the title of the chapter you've given, I think I loved it. Protecting the economy from the executive. Right. So if you could just take us through your thinking, right? Shakti Das ji was an IS officer. I'm sure you would have encountered Shakti Das in your years as an IS officer. Has the RBI been successful in protecting the economy from the executive, sir?
Well, I think so. I think so. And why I say this was, I'll give you an example from closer to my being in the government. Dr. Subbarao and myself, we were colleagues in the finance ministry. I moved as a CAG, and within a very short time of my moving out, Dr. Subbarao was selected to go as governor of the Reserve Bank. Now, once we occupied the chairs that we occupied, I think we distanced ourselves from the government per se. The CAG, of course, is totally independent. The Reserve Bank of India is also an autonomous body, of course, mandated to look after monetary policy, regulatory issues, etc., etc., etc. Whereas on the other hand, the government looks after the fiscal policy and issues associated with that. Now, very naturally, the ambitions of both become, RBI would like to control inflation, would like to control liquidity, and create a monetary policy or curate a monetary policy which will control inflation. On the other hand, government is wanting to push growth. Through their fiscal policy or whatever it is. And quite often, they tend to get onto each other's turf. Let me put it that way. But why I say that protecting the economy from the executive is that successive governors in the Reserve Bank of India have not allowed the government, or let me put it more candidly, the finance minister, to trample over the mandate which has been assigned to them by being the Reserve Bank of India. See, I don't know whether it's fair to say that or not, but a government's vision is 5 years. Government in a parliamentary democracy is 5 years.
Yeah.
And they want to showcase that 5 years in whichever way they want to suit their own political interests. But on the other hand, the RBI should and has had a longer vision. So whether it was Subbarao, it was Dr. Rajan, whether it was, and now Shaktikant Das, why they do align with the government, because all of them are seeking to do good to the economy, but in different ways. Now, the Reserve Bank regulates banks, but why I say this, 57% of the total banking community is owned by the government of India. So, immediately the government becomes an interested party. So it is a tough job for the governor of the Reserve Bank or the Reserve Bank itself to pull up an agency owned by the government. To that extent, it becomes very important, and the RBI has to do disciplining of these public sector banks also, amongst others. And well, at one point of time, around the time that I was in government, about 70 to 72% of the credit or the loaning book was public sector banks. Now, of course, it has declined, but then this is where, whether it was defending interest rates, whether it was always government was, and I've given instances in the chapter that I did, where the government wanted the banks to reduce the BPLR. basic prime lending rate because it suited government's growth, interest to do that. Whereas the RBI held its ground and said no, it should not, because technically or after making the desired calculations, it came to a figure which it thought was more appropriate, and taking on the finance minister on that particular issue, or public sector banks. So to that extent, I think whether it's a bureaucrat or an economist like Dr. Rajan, much depends upon the chair you occupy, and you have to ensure the autonomy, the independence, and the professional character of that particular chair. It is incumbent upon the occupant to do that.
I think very nicely put. I think Subbarao ji has written a book, right? Who Moved My Cheese? And in that
Who moved my interest rate?
Who moved my interest rates? I'm sorry. Who moved my interest rates? And in that he lays out his memorable ding dong with the then finance minister. I'm sure we're looking forward to Shakti Das ji writing a good book after he demerits office. Let's come to the big one, right? The Supreme Court, right? Because this is a favorite bugbear of Indians. We are perpetually worrying about the independence of the Supreme Court. Countries like China, I don't think, have anything like this, where the Supreme Court stands utterly distinct from the executive, and the Supreme Court stands distinct from the parliament as well, right? We're one of those rare, I think, third world economies. We've created an independent judiciary. We in India tend to be fairly cynical about this. What's your view? Has the Supreme Court been able to maintain its independence and hold up its end of the bargain in the Indian Constitution's construct?
I would say yes, and I would very emphatically say yes. I mean, starting from the time of upholding the fundamental rights. I mean, I'm talking from Mrs. Gandhi's times onwards. When yes, one can say that there was an attempt to try and browbeat. There have been attempts to browbeat the courts. There's no denying that fact. But I would say that the Supreme Court has withstood all those pressures. And I must say, during our time itself, the 2G itself, the spectrum issue, the Supreme Court took up the issue because of a PIL that was filed, and in open court said that we are not basing our judgment or our findings on the CAG's report, because the CAG's report is before the parliament. So we are not taking that issue at all. Not what the CAG has pointed out, but we are basing our judgment on the facts which have been produced before us by various entities, various bodies which had appeared before the court. Then it was the government which contested the mandate of the CAG to do what is known as performance audit. We had done a performance audit on the spectrum or the Commonwealth Games, etc. You see, there is the normal compliance, transactional audits, etc., the financial audit and the compliance audit, but this is a performance audit that we did. The government contested that. Supreme Court heard the entire arguments that the government had to put out, and took the decision that the CAG was well within his mandate to do performance audit. And the title that I gave to my book, Not Just an Accountant, is actually taken from the judgment of the Supreme Court itself, where the Supreme Court said that the CAG is a constitutional authority. It's not just a munim. That's a word they used. And I didn't use the word munim because thinking that probably lots of people may not understand what it really means. And that's how I think faith in the Supreme Court, there have been judgments which people have not agreed with. But then the approach of the court is purely legalistic. They will look at the legal aspect of things as much as the CAG would look after the audit aspects of things, propriety of whatever act that was. And I think the Supreme Court has held its ground. And even today, in a large number of things that you would be seeing, the Supreme Court has taken on the executive and established its own credibility.
I think nicely put. I think many of us in India like in casual conversation to sort of abuse the institutions of our own country. And then you get a Supreme Court verdict like the one you got late last week. I don't know in how many countries the Supreme Court will basically go against the executive and restore a leading member of the opposition back to Parliament. So long live the Supreme Court. I'll hand it over to Salil to take questions from our clients. Folks, keep punching those questions into the Q&A box. Salil will take as many as he can. Over to you, Salil.
Right. So we'll take the first question from Rohit Acharya. He has two questions. So the first one is, over a 10-year period of the last decade, how do you think the RTI system, and the associated bodies, including the quality of replies that they have been giving, how has that changed? Has it worsened? That seems to be his base case.
Yeah, Salil, in answer to what Rohit has asked, what has happened is RTI, or the right to information, which was introduced by the UPA sometime in 2005, was a landmark decision taken by them because it really put the focus on the citizen in a parliamentary democracy. It gave the citizen a right to ask anything of government, and the government had to give a reply in 30 days' time. But what has happened after that is that this right, has been misused in a large number of ways. I'll give you a small example. When I was in the finance ministry, I was asked a question in the RTI: how many vehicles does the Punjab National Bank own? Now, look at the amount of work that will be required to collect that statistic, number one. Number two, what is the value of that question? If I put it out in public domain, whether it's 5,000 or 6,000 vehicles, doesn't really matter, you see. But obviously somebody was trying to fix somebody and hence asked that question. Now, if a facility which is given to the public is in some ways diluted and not really utilized the way it needs to be utilized, it doesn't serve its purpose. So that's why what has happened is that the government has got inundated with queries, and it becomes very difficult to sift out the real genuine question, or the question which really needs to be answered to the public in entirety, from the facile kind of a question, that I just referred to. There has been only one issue where certain dilution has taken place, and that is that the term of the commissioners who sit in the Central Information Commission, that was fixed at 5 years with no change in it. Once appointed, you could not remove him except by, as happens to the Accountant General, the Auditor General also, by impeachment or things like that. But that has now been diluted to say that at the, at the mercy, at the pleasure of the president, as it said. So when the executive wants to remove the information commissioner, the government can remove that, he or she, at that point of time, which is, I would think, a certain amount of dilution.
I see, right. And Rohit's second question is on the integrity of macro data that, say, departments or organizations like the NSSO put out. Do you think that has changed in the last 10 years, for better or worse?
Rohit, this is a very difficult question for me to answer because I do not have access to what would be called a credible data. But to the extent that the government puts out data, they run a very serious risk if they are putting out data which is not credible or its integrity can be suspect. Because then what you're doing is you are opening yourself to question. And if it is questioned in Parliament, that's the worst thing that can happen to a bureaucrat or a minister if his credibility is, or professional integrity is questioned and he's proven wrong. So I have no reason to believe that the data is in any way suspect. But I cannot vouch for the credibility of that data because I have no source or way to verify it myself and authenticate it.
So if I could just offer my 10 cents on that, Rohit, where I think people like us as investors are getting a little bit more concerned is not so much the macro aggregates, right? Consumption or investment or GDP itself. Where we are getting a little bit more concerned is, for example, the census hasn't happened right now for 15 years. Very difficult, therefore, for us to get a sense of where India's population is growing and where it isn't. Secondly, anything which is about income distribution across the population. Those sorts of surveys are increasingly hard to come by. So distribution of income and data on population and income is, I think, the bigger challenge rather than macro aggregates per se. Back to you, Salil.
Right. We have two related questions. One is from Murli KS and the other one is from Samir Madan. I think the essence of the question is that, the judiciary, you said, is the last hope in a way for Indians. Do you think the judiciary needs to be under some sort of scrutiny like an organization of the office of the CAG? We see a lot of pending cases. The 2G scam itself, we have not really seen any punishment. Was it because the loss was presumptive and not maybe actual, or was there political reasons for that? And Samir also cites the case that, for example, Satyam, the scandal which happened in the US, it's already been settled, but in India, we still seem to be going around in circles on that.
Yeah, see, if you start questioning the accountability of the judiciary, the parliament, or the accountant general, you'll get nowhere, really. There are certain institutions that you have to respect. I'll just give you an example as far as the Auditor General is concerned. The Auditor General in any country is called the Supreme Audit Institution, which means the highest body conducting audit. Now, which agency in that country can kind of hold up the Auditor General accountable? So what we did, the practice we started in 2011 was, we asked our peers in our different countries to audit our procedures. And the Auditor General of Australia came forward and did an audit. And he did an audit of 7 of the systems that we had audited. One of which was the 2G also. And there's a report. He's found fault with us also. We put out the report on 30th of September in 2011. It's available on our website, So the point is, you can have judgments of a court which you do not agree with. But then, accountability cannot be taken to an extreme. To that extent, there are certain agencies that we have to rely upon. We have to take them credible. And I would feel that if 99% they are reliable, human fallibility applies as much to you and I as it applies to a judge sitting in the Supreme Court, So to that extent, I think our institutions are credible, they are robust, and they are manned by people who are professionally competent to manage them.
Can I come in here Saril, on a question on the BCCI? So the Supreme Court put you in charge of the BCCI, I think best part of 2 years, right? And you got to see the BCCI from inside. So for people like us, right, who from the outside keep thinking that India has more money, the BCCI has more money than the rest of the world cricket boards put together. And both in your book, you've given some numbers, the newspapers publish numbers that the BCCI alone makes more money than England, Australia, the whole world put together. And there's no dearth of Indians playing cricket, right? We are, out of 1.4 billion people, we at least have a 200 million strong middle class playing cricket. And yet we win next to nothing, right? A small country like Australia consistently wins major tournaments with a budget the fraction of the BCCI. So if money isn't the problem, talent isn't the problem, basis your stint at the BCCI, what is it that results in India not winning anything big in cricket? I think since 83, we won one World Cup in 83, one in 07 and one in 2011. And yet a tiny country like Australia keeps beating us. What's wrong? Where's the BCCI erred?
Saurabh, BCCI is a fairly credible organization. The time that we were there, you see, India is a cricket crazy country. And BCCI makes its money not really on gate money or something, but by media rights. That's where all the money comes from. And I think IPL, there are very strong views on the IPL, whether it's good, it's not good, bad, or whatever it is. And it's the money spinner, like it or not. So it's a very interesting model, commercial model that was created, wherein sitting in your drawing rooms, you get 45 days of excellent, what is, I would call, sportainment. There is sports and there is entertainment. So in those, 40 overs that are bowled every evening, you get, after you come back a hard day's work, you sit at home with your family, you have your dinner and you're watching these games. It's excellent entertainment. And I think the IPL or whatever it is has been able to, earlier we used to have what? Ranji Trophy, Test cricket. So cricketers had an opportunity to excel in Ranji Trophy and be selected for the national team. Today, you have 10 teams. Each team has 25 people in its retinue. So you have 250 people of the Surya Kumar Yadav type who, get an opportunity to play at a national level and come into the public thing. Now, why we did not do well, I think there are seasons for it all. I mean, look at the game of hockey. We were right at the top of the world at one point of time. We have deteriorated. Other countries have gone far ahead of. Australia is one of those countries. Netherlands is another country which is doing so well. So I would sincerely believe that these are what I would call seasons, where we did do well in 2007. We did do well in 2011. We have just about the best national cricket team today. But unfortunately, and I'm purposely using that word, that in international events we choke.
Yeah.
So it is not for want of technically good players, but I think it is for want of that big match temperament that we are not able to put through. That's about all. Yeah. And I think we need to be coached there.
Yeah, perhaps we're still a society too scared of failure, and perhaps the Australians are ahead of us in that regard. But let's hope that the coming World Cup has better news. Salil, back to you.
Right. So one more question is on how the government using the term broadly procures, right? Last, say, decade or so, we have seen a lot of technology coming in, online auctions, bidding, to make the process more transparent or more fair. Now, do you think that just putting in an online model of procurement really changes the way transparency or fairness comes into the system, or is more to be done? And related to that is that, how much more do you think we need to do? I mean, what are the other departments or other functions where this is needed but is not been implemented yet?
Well, see, what I feel is that putting into place an online system to a very large extent has removed the fallacies of the lacuna of having an individual put in his, what I would say, subjective judgment in, a bidding process. Okay, so to a very large extent, it has helped in removing that portion of it. But we need to perfect this online system. See, one unfortunate part about the government is that we go for what Saurabh just mentioned, the L1 principle, the lowest principle. But, this is a bit of a misnomer. The norm says that you go for L1. However, if you are convinced that technically or for other reasons which are based on merit, you find L1 to not be the best to be able to deliver the purpose for which that bidding is being done, you could go in for L2. But as in government, where the process sometimes takes over, the decision itself, you have to record your reasons in writing why you overlooked L1 in selecting L2. And that's just the point that Mr. Naik has made in today's Business Standard. I skimmed through, I didn't read the entire thing, I just saw the part of it. And that is exactly the problem that we had in the 2G issue. Agencies which were not professionally competent to handle spectrum or telecommunication or telephony issues are the agencies which got the license. And then they went about selling that license or associating with others. So it has to be, the bidding process has to be a culmination, the best culmination of technically competent, professionally competent, as well as commercially viable. And that's why, we need to perfect the system of online being able to do the bidding process.
But it's a step in the right direction.
I think it's a step in the right direction.
Right.
I think it's a step in the right direction. Certainly so.
Great. Now here's an interesting question from Shishir Dikshit, and he says that it's widely being said that the government is taking over control of a lot of institutions in the country. I'm presuming he refers to institutions including, say, the Election Commission and the judiciary. So what are your views on this? Is that really, is that something that's really happening, or is just media hype?
Well, from times immemorial, and I just incidentally mentioned about Indira Gandhi, trying to overpower the judiciary. Governments would love to take over the institutions because, governments want their writ to run. But these accountability institutions, when I talk about accountability institutions, I'm talking about the CAG, I'm talking about the Election Commission, I'm talking about the Vigilance Commission, I'm talking the Union Public Service Commission, which selects IAS officers, kind of officers, etc., which by constitution have been made autonomous and independent. There is nothing which stops anybody occupying those hot seats in those institutions from being totally independent. The government can do nothing about it because each one of these things, you are assured a term of 6 years. And if you have to be removed, if the Election Commission has to be removed or the CAG has to be removed, he can be removed only by a process of impeachment, which means 2/3 majority in Parliament, which is not easy. It's just like removing a judge of the or Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, So it's a similar process. So there may have been some instances where an institution has been found wanting. But by and large, I believe that they have been independent. They have been autonomous. People occupying those positions have preferred to leave the institution than to be cowed down by anybody who is political or the political bosses at that point of time. So by and large, I think they have withstood the test of time. And I don't think we need to doubt them.
Great, good to know that. One more question is about, we are a federal, we follow federal structure right now. You mentioned a couple of times that the quality of people in the institution, that the center are really competent. Now, obviously, they go from the state to the center on deputation. But how do you think the governance framework really is at the state level, both from an administrative and bureaucratic point of view?
Yeah, see, at the state level, there have been some pulls and pressures. There have been attempts because what happens is at the state level, it's a regional interest that matters. And when you have a bureaucracy of the kind that in an IPS officer or a IAS officer, he's there as a permanent bureaucracy. So his vision is 15 years, 20 years, or whatever it is, whereas the elected government comes in for 5 years only. And the elected government at that point of time would be willing to sacrifice anything to ensure that its regional interests are protected. So the government in power, the political party in power, would like to ensure that its regional interests are protected. And that's where sometimes we have had a breakdown. Sometimes we have been able to withstand those pressures. But unfortunately, when coalition governments come to stay, it makes it that much more difficult for the permanent bureaucracy to be able to manage the political pressures that emerge, because they can be conflicting pressures. And that's where the bureaucrats, capacity to be able to walk that thin line where he's objective, he's well-balanced, and he's independent becomes very critical. So you may have people who at times falter, but by and large, people have been, I've given a large number of examples in a couple of chapters that I have written, where people have withstood those pressures and they have suffered. And how have they suffered? Only that they have been transferred. It doesn't make any difference. So what all of us have, what I would call, say, developed thick skins. All of us have learned the business of keeping the family in the state headquarters to ensure that education kind of issues are taken care of, undisturbed. And we, in a suitcase, are willing to travel anywhere else in the state where we are posted. Once you are prepared for that, and it's very easy to convince the political executive that, look, I mean business, things fall into place, because the politician, the good thing about a politician is he's an excellent judge of people. So he realizes that there is this Salil Desai who's not going to give way. So what he would do is he will be willing to give a yard to take a mile later in some way or the other. And I sincerely feel there is no harm in doing that barter. I would rather stay in the post and do long-term good than bother about a small, in our times, 15 bags of cement, or transferring a deputy Naib Tahsildar from X place to Y place. Doesn't really matter, as long as the long-term vision is taken care of.
So folks, this is not just empty bombast. So if you read not just an accountant, there are lots of case studies from Vinod's career, right? So there's one in the early part of the book about, there was a village in Kerala or a district that wanted to host the Last Temptation of Christ. It's apparently a very controversial play, and Vinod was in the hot seat. And he had to decide whether that play will happen. If the Last Temptation of Christ was sort of allowed to go on stage, one community said they would go sort of mad with anger. If it wasn't allowed to go on stage, another community said they would go mad with anger, and there was political pressure on Vinod. There are several such examples. I think there's a Olympic pool that had to be constructed in another part of Kerala. So if you want to understand these predicaments in public life, and you want to sort of see beyond these black and white stories we tell ourselves in day-to-day life, I think it's worth reading Vinod's books. One part of your book, right, and I'm now referring to Transforming Good Governance. The chapter which really shook me was this. If I had to sort of tell you which chapter was the hardest hitting. Like many people, I have this mental model that government is trying to do this and government is trying to do that, and I see the world as a kind of contest between good and bad and so on, right? But in this chapter, in Transforming Good Governance, right, in the Parliament of India, the point you've made is far more worrying. The point you make in this chapter about the Parliament is that you're saying that the Parliament undermines itself. It's not just that the government is doing something or the other. You're saying as an institution, our parliamentarians are basically undermining Parliament, and in so doing, the effectiveness of the institution, the accountability of Parliament, its ability to have oversight of the executive, all of that is coming into question. Could you just sort of take us through that thinking and why is this happening? Why would an institution undermine its own effectiveness?
I think I have drawn attention to two issues. One is the quality of debate. The quality of debate in Parliament is directly dependent upon the quality of the people who get elected to Parliament. Now, unfortunately, and this has been brought out by a large number of agencies, where the agency called the Association of Democratic Reform, so what's the ADR, what's it called? Where they say that it is not the professional competent of a particular particular candidate which is chosen by a party to contest an election on their behalf to the parliament, but it's a winnability of that candidate. How, what is the chance, probability of that candidate winning, And the moment you go in for winnability, then you lose sight of the content of that particular candidate to be able to do a debate in parliament. How good he is to understand the issues that arise in parliament, because ultimately you are going to debate bills. You are going to be legislating on various issues which affect the common man. So that's where I mentioned that it gets undermined, because the quality of the people who come in are, dependent on the winnability factor of any candidate. Number two factor I've mentioned is in relation to the Auditor General, the CAG's office, where I've talked about the Public Accounts Committee. The Public Accounts Committee is the one which examines the reports of the Auditor General. And they are supposed to go into those reports in detail. What I've mentioned is that the Public Accounts Committee has about 22 meetings in a whole year. The Auditor General puts in about 60 reports in a year. Now, how many reports can be examined in those 22 meetings? To that extent, the accountability of a government department in government is not questioned. The accountability is not questioned. Yeah. Reports become routine. They are sent to the departments for them to give the reply, and that reply can be anything. So that's where I said that Parliament tends to undermine itself, because in the recent past also it has happened that a whole budget session is lost because people are boycotting Parliament, disrupting Parliament, and the most important document of the government in any financial year is the budget document. The debate on the budget, what funds will you provide for what schemes, that it gets passed without a debate. That's a very unfortunate tradition, So to that extent, it is Parliament. Parliament is not accountable to anybody in that sense. It is accountable to the citizen of India, because ultimate stakeholder is a citizen. But then if the Parliament or the parliamentarians cannot check themselves, reform themselves, and hold themselves accountable, there is nothing you can do. In that extent, it was in that sense that I said it is undermining it.
Well, thank you very much, Vinod. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your books. I think you initially changed the country as a CAG, and then I think you changed Indian cricket for the better as the head of the BCCI. But I think your books give the rest of us who haven't had the privilege of sitting inside these august institutions, gives the rest of us a window into how India really functions. And what I think we are taking away is, whilst things aren't perfect, they're not as bad as the media would like many of us to believe. There's plenty of work to be done. So I think for Salil's generation, my generation, there's plenty to do. But thank you very much for changing the country for the better. And thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Have a great evening.
Thanks, Saurabh. It was a pleasure, but I at no point of time ever feel that I have changed the country for a better, whatever it is. There was a certain mandate given to me. I fulfilled that mandate to the best of my own conscience. That's about all. So thank you very much for having me. It was such a delight.
Sir.
Thank you, Salil. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.